Uh, Good morning, everyone, and I would like to introduce Shri Amrish Kumar, who is from the IAS Rajasthan cadre. So, he was a BTech graduate in computer science from IIT Bombay, and while in college, he was very interested in wildlife, bird watching, conservation, and also he took a year off in 1999, visited a lot of people working on wildlife conservation, environmental activism. And then he worked as an engineer for 3 years in Silicon Valley and came back and joined the Rajasthan cadre of the IAS. So, he has been the collector of Jaisalmer, Pali, and other districts in Rajasthan. He was also instrumental in initiating a proposal to expand the area of Javai Leopard Conservation and Community Reserve in Pali in 2014. And right now he is on deputation for the Kaveri Calling project in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. So I would really like to welcome him for the very first of our talks at WCS India, and we are hoping that we will call in more people from diverse backgrounds so that people can learn more perspectives, gain more lateral views, and I think overall that helps us in our creativity and building partnerships and collaborations. And especially for the people who are just joining this field, I think it's really useful to get advice and perspective from people who have experience in trying to use their positions to initiate a change, and that is something I would really like to hear from him. So Amrish ji, welcome to WCS India, and I really would like to thank you for being part of this talk. And I had some question answers. Some housekeeping rules is that we will enable the chat box, so you can put your questions over there. It's also live on YouTube, so you all can watch it there later as well. So starting with the first question, Amrish sir, is that you joined the IIT, you went to Silicon Valley. Why did you join the administrative services then?
So the simple answer to that is because my father had a great desire to see his son in IAS. So while being in IIT, I visited so many national parks and sanctuaries all across India. So I had a lot of exposure to IFS. We used to meet all the field directors of the tiger reserves and the DFOs. And so I appeared for Indian Forest Service also along with the IAS exam. And I got through in that as well. I got Manipur Tripura cadre in Forest Service, and I got Rajasthan here. I think if the cadres were different, maybe I would have been a Forest Service officer.
Yeah, okay. So you say you started bird watching, and do you still bird watch? And if so, what were your recent trips and your recent sightings?
My bird watching started in Pachmadi. Before that, I had done a few trips. In fact, I would want to recount my first wildlife trip when I was in IIT Bombay. With the Wildlife Club, they used to organize in every vacation a trip to a protected area in India. So that year, after my first year in college, they were organizing it to Eravikulam National Park. And we went there, about 15 of us, and none of the seniors came. So everybody who went, it was their first wildlife trip. And I happened to become the leader of the group just because I was booking all the train tickets and stuff. So when we went there, I still remember that first scene sitting there in Rajamalai estate and watching the clouds come up from below, all these mountain tops looking as islands in the clouds. And I had this kind of what I can call as a spiritual experience, so to say, sitting there, feeling like whatever I'm doing, it's just meaningless. These mountains have been around for thousands of years, and the clouds have been coming and going just like this. And Nilgiri Thar walking around in that place, the whole thing felt surreal. And suddenly all the cares melted away. I felt a sense of joyfulness and blissfulness being there. And from that point, I was hooked on to, I associated that whole experience with being in the forest. And from that day, every opportunity I got in college, I would run to some national park or sanctuary and, would organize trips, take people from starting from 8, 10 people groups to even hundreds of people we took to Corbett in 1996. And just for this talk, I was doing a count of how many national parks and sanctuaries I have visited over the years. I think I managed to reach a count of 50 and then stopped. So mostly in India, but some in US and Bolivia and Malaysia, a few places outside India as well. And it's always been a pleasure for me to go to a pristine forest and just be there. So bird watching started for me in Pachmadi with one of the seniors, and when he started showing me birds, I was like, अच्छा ये भी होता है, ये भी होता है. अच्छा मुझे तो पता था कि सिर्फ एक कबूतर होता है, चिड़िया होती है और मैना होता है. तो I only knew 3 kinds of birds before that. And when he showed me white-cheeked bulbul and red-vented bulbul, and I was like, oh, really? Okay, man, I didn't know that. And then from that point on, onwards, it took off. I bought all the bird watching books, and I think my peak bird watching experience was in Kedarnath Sanctuary in 1999. So me and my wife, both of us went, and we spent about a week there, and every day the kind of birds we saw, it's still etched in my mind. So many species of birds we saw. We crossed some 150 species just roaming there, and the kind of birds which you only see in that book, you don't see them around. Those all kinds of little woolly things running around in the undergrowth and things with huge beaks. You just found them, walking around a stream bed. And so bird watching has been a big pleasure. And do I still bird watch? Occasionally, once in a while. After joining the IAS, it's come down dramatically. It's quite contradictory. One of my motivations to join the service was that I will not to go to national parks and sanctuaries, getting permissions and booking guest houses would be very easy. That was one of my thoughts when I joined the service. But to the contrary, I've not had much time to go and visit places after I joined.
Yeah, thank you. You say that, so there's definitely a liking and a love for nature and natural history. And I'm also surprised to hear that you were instrumental, like in the creation of the community conservation reserve for leopards in Javai. And why did you undertake that work? And what was like the process that you had to follow to get this done? Can you give a little bit of insight on that?
Yes. So when I got Rajasthan cadre, in Rajasthan, I had only heard of Ranthambore and Sariska. So I thought maybe I'll get a posting in one of these districts and maybe I'll do something for the national park sanctuary. One hears of, there is a whole process in creation of national parks and sanctuaries where you have to hear objections and get a final notification issued. I had read about how so many protected areas in India, the final notification never got issued because the process never got completed. So I never got that opportunity. But when I went to Pali and people told me that you can see leopards here, I was really, okay, really? So I went to Javai and I saw leopard. In fact, that was my second leopard sighting. Before that, one leopard I'd seen at IIT Bombay campus early morning one day. And here they were showing leopards like you see tigers. It was like a proper leopard safari. And it was really amazing, beautiful. Then I found out about the protected status of that. And I found that they have a Javai reserve. But then the local forest officers, they told me, sir, the leopards are found in this entire region. There are any number of such hillocks in this area where leopards live. And they've lived here for thousands of years along with people with no issues. So then I said, okay, is all of it part of the Javai Leopard Reserve? They said, no, sir, only a small part is there. Then I said, why don't we include everything as part of the Javai Leopard Reserve? So when I went to the Wildlife Act, a new addition had been made in the form of Conservation Reserve and Community Reserve. These are two new types of protected areas which Wildlife Protection Act has included. So Conservation Reserve is a place where government land is declared as a reserve without making it forest land. So when we say forest land, essentially forest land gets transferred to the forest department. Forest department becomes the owner, and then a lot of restrictive usage comes into play. The forest department, I mean, you all know about it, how difficult it is for, even whether it is a researcher or a local person to deal with the forest guard and what kind of issues people face. And I mean, I'm not trying to blame the department, it's just the way it is structured. So now today in India, if you want to effect more conservation, community reserve and conservation reserve are two ways to do it. Essentially, when we say the word conservation, we are trying to conserve an ecosystem. And you may use a certain species like the great Indian bustard or the tiger as a flagship species. But what you are trying to conserve is an entire ecosystem. And the ecosystem also includes the human beings who live there, because it's only because of their relationships with those species, that wildlife, the ecosystem, that is why the ecosystem is surviving. See, the countries from which this whole concept of protected areas has come, Western Europe and US, I mean, if we look at their status of their wildlife, I think India is way better off than what they have done to their animals and other species. So in India, the local community is an essential ingredient of the ecosystem. And I think the conservation reserve and community reserve has given recognition to that aspect. And what is different about community and conservation reserves is that the leaders of that local community, they get to have a say in it officially. A committee gets formed where, along with the local forest officer, the sarpanch and the local elected representatives and anybody else who is concerned with that, they can all become part of the committee, and that committee decides what kind of land use would happen in that area. See, when we say protected area, essentially what we are saying is we are defining a certain land use. So as long as the community decides to have the kind of land use which lets the biodiversity of that area continue to stay and grow, then, I mean, the whole planet can be a protected area in that sense. It's protected by the community. So the difference between a conservation reserve and a community reserve is conservation reserve is declared on government land and community reserve is declared on private land. So in that area, there was both types of land. So we sent two proposals to the government, one for a community reserve, one for a conservation reserve. For community reserve, it's important to get the in principle approval of the local panchayats. So when I was there, I called the local MLA and called the sarpanches of that area. We had one large meeting where I told them about how getting it declared as a community reserve will empower them, how they will get to choose what kind of industry comes in that area or what kind of other economic activity happens in that area. The law empowers them to make that choice. So we had one very good meeting there where we discussed all these things. And I think by the time I sent the proposal and I mean, I got transferred out of Pali and the proposal went to the state government. And I recently found out that after about 4 years, they notified the conservation reserve, but I think the community reserve is still pending with them because that kind of consensus building which had to happen with all the panchayats there, that process never got completed.
Yeah, thank you. So can you also provide us some examples of other, outcomes of your work? I think you also worked on the app Dhara, which is a Rajasthan government app for where you can access any land record. Like if I have a land record, I can just put in my surname and I can access the patta, if I'm not mistaken. So, can you tell us a little bit about getting this done and the feedback it has, the implications it also has?
Yes. So, I mean, Vidya said that I have a degree in computer science and I worked in Silicon Valley for a few years. After that, I worked at IIT Bombay also for a year and a half as a system administrator. So I put all this experience to use in the government wherever I went. See, one of the aspects of what one is able to do in the government, one thing I would say is that in the hierarchy of services, the Indian Administrative Service is the key service which runs the government. So there are other services which are technical services. If you look at the police service, their role is to take care of crime and law and order. If you look at the forest service, their role is to take care of the forest. But all the key decision-making positions in the government are with the Indian Administrative Service. Whether it is at the district level, whether it is at the state level or at the central level, all the key positions are held by IAS officers. I would say 90% of them are held by IAS officers. So an IAS officer is hugely empowered in whichever position he goes. If he wants to rejig the system, he can. Any place, he has that option to rejig the system. Of course, it takes a lot of time and energy to do it. It takes a lot of effort to do it. You have to build a lot of consensus with your bosses and your subordinates to make that happen. But so for me, see, another thing I would like to bring up here is that for a lot of people, what they do in their life is essentially a livelihood. What they're trying to do is earn a living and take care of their family and maybe become a little famous here and there. That's, I mean, I would say, I would equate being famous to establishment of a pecking order in the animal kingdom, and rest of it is the survival process. And there's a competitive process. All that is built into the human brain, because we have a reptilian brain, we have a mammalian brain, and there is also a human brain. So all those brains are active all the time. So for most people, their lives are about this. So even though people may join the Indian Administrative Service, even though our job is to provide leadership, but for a whole lot of them, their experience of life is all about survival. So when you are in survival process, you will just survive in whatever system you are. You are not going to recreate it. You are not going to do anything significant with it. But for whatever reasons, for me, it has always been about, let's see, what is it that I'm supposed to do? Actually, all I tried to do in my career was, what is it that is expected of me as a leader of this organization? So when I went to the land records department, I could clearly see that all the land records data has been available with the government for at least 100 years. It is there in various paper documents. It is even there in certain online servers. But when I joined the land records department, we had 200 different servers across Rajasthan. Every tehsil had its own server sitting in the tehsil premises. And if you wanted to get a copy of your land records, you had to go there, and that operator had to be present. You pay him some fee and he will give you a printout. There was no way to search it. There was no way to look at it. They had prepared an online portal also before me, but in that portal, the data was dated. It would not be up to date, because all the updation process which was there was manual. They used to manually update it, and then it would take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years to get that thing online. So when I looked at all that, I said, why can't we just have a transaction-based system, a live system, just like the way you have it in your banks? Your whatever shows on your mobile app or whatever shows on your ICICI bank login, everything is live. And if you go to the branch, that is also live. It's all the same data. So we just took that thing and we tried to do it. And I remember a few of my seniors, when I went and described this to them, they said, yeah, NIC has been trying to automate this land records for last 20 years. Let's see, what is possible now. But I think we did it in about 6 months to a year's time. That's all it took to really get this thing going. I mean, we got hold of another IIT Bombay graduate. I met him in one of the alumni meets, and he got inspired by the whole conversation. He said, okay, sir, I am willing to do it. So then somehow we worked with him, we created the whole footprint and did it. And this Dhara app, which has come out of it, is unique in its presentation. I mean, many other state governments have apps, but nobody has everything in one place. So in Dhara, you can get a copy of your land record. You can search it by your name. You can search it by Khasra number. You can search it by village. You can even get a copy of the village map. You can get a copy of the Khasra number, that plot of land which you own, the map. And there is also a feature there which says, where am I? So if you go to any place in Rajasthan and you go to where am I, it'll tell you on which survey number you are standing and who owns that piece of land. Plus, it has a feature where you can get all the historical records. So in land records, it's important to have the history of your thing, or what they call as a chain of records. So all of that is also searchable by survey number. It will tell you who owned your piece of land in the last 70 years. All those records also you can fetch from that. And I mean, there were many more things we had planned, but like in government, even though you are tremendously empowered, but at the same time, there is a certain small amount of tenure which you get. Actually, the longest tenure I've had was in land records, where I spent about 2 years and 3 months. And so time ran out, and wherever Dhara is, it stands there. And I think it's got, I don't know how many downloads it has. I think lakhs of downloads now. It's become quite popular.
Yeah, thanks, Amrish sir. So a question that is like dear to my heart is like, how do we get people like us who are basically knowledge gatherers to contribute to, you know, society? Like we all want to contribute to policy, we want to contribute to change, and I don't think we are really effective in doing that, as given the number of people that are present in, you know, working on these issues. And you as an administrator, how do you see our role in contributing to societal change for people and for the planet?
See, one aspect of wildlife researcher is, one of the very good things about it is that it is a field where only those people who like being in the forest, who like wildlife, who have a love for wildlife. As far as I know, it has still not become, you know, like BA or BTech computer science, which everybody wants to do because they'll get a lot of money. So that is a very good part of it, that anybody who's here is because, you know, they feel inspired when they're in the forest. They feel inspired when they see an animal or a bird or an insect, whatever they are studying. So I think that inspiration and that sense of purpose and joyfulness, which the researcher associates with his work, is a key aspect of bringing about change in society. If you want to make a change in society, it's very important that you are inspired. If you are inspired and people meet you, then they would want to do something. If they see you, okay, this man has come because he has a vested interest, then they're not interested. So, but this inspiration, which the researchers have, now, one thing is, if you are really a pure science kind of person, you know, pure ecology, okay, you go and study the interaction of a particular species of ants with a particular species of fungus or something like that, and you want to publish a paper on it, that's one kind of situation. Then you're just in it for the fun of it. But if you also care to conserve the habitats which house these wonderful animals or plants, then you have to work with the human beings also who live there. So see, the way that today's wildlife researcher is studying is coming from a certain Western model of appreciation of nature. But the communities which live here, they may not have this kind of appreciation that you have, but they have their own kind of appreciation. I mean, all the food that we eat today, whether it is mainstream food or the, you know, really tasty things which you get to eat in the forest, all that somebody has selected that, and it is the local community which over the years has figured out, okay, this thing tastes like this, let me cook it like this, and various you know, medicines they make out of it. There's a lot of knowledge there which they have gathered by observation of the area. So, and definitely they have a certain affinity for the land in which their, you know, forefathers have lived and grown. So if you can take that affinity that they have for their land with the Western model of looking at and conservation, and you put it together into a model where going forward they can benefit economically from it. See, anyway, their relationship is economic in nature because they are living there, so their livelihood is dependent on that land. But the way society in India is today, the way the discourse in India is, the way people talk about it, everybody wants to move from a rural area to an urban area, from an urban area to a bigger city, from a bigger city to outside India. This is how the movement is going, because that is what we consider as progress. That is the definition of progress today. That is the definition of being ambitious today for young people, that move out of where you are. Wherever you are, that's not good enough. So with that kind of situation, all the communities, their young people would also be affected by this way of thinking, and they would also want to move out. But for them, moving out has to do with their economic condition as perceived. Just the other day I was talking to Vidya and I was saying that in my perception, India is not a poor country, because everywhere I have gone, if I go to a so-called poor person's home, maybe he lives in a kacha house, but the kind of food he gives me is better than, what I get in any city in India. Or what, I mean, that kind of food definitely is not available in Western Europe and in US, except in some very high-priced gourmet restaurants. So that quality of food which they eat, both in terms of nutrition and the freshness of it, it signifies that they are not poor. I mean, poverty doesn't, I mean, just because I wear some branded clothes, or if I have an Apple laptop or a phone or a modern house, that's not necessarily the only way to look at being, somebody's poor or rich. But that is the accepted definition of poverty, because somebody, he only earns $1 a day, so he's poor. That's how the economists are defining poverty. So in that sense, these people who are living there, with these people, they are youngsters. They are all looking forward to becoming prosperous in the modern sense of the word. So if you can find a way where they can earn some cash income while living there in their traditional ways, on top of that, they can get some cash income. There are various ways of doing it. Tourism is one way of making it happen, and some NTFP, maybe growing some honey, maybe growing some herbs there, which are used in Ayurveda. Various different ways of doing it, where they can earn some income and while continuing to stay in their habitat. So if you can find a way like that, and you are able to generate a consensus on that with the leaders of that community, then I think there is a way to conserve that for posterity. You can convince them to create a community reserve around whatever kind of wildlife species which is found there. Call it I don't know, whatever, crane conservation reserve. Like, there are a lot of places where cranes are found, and there are places where ducks are found. Whatever, you can take one species and build some branding around it. A glamorous looking bird or glamorous looking animal, and you can create a branding around it. I mean, all this is essentially the way the modern world works is through branding. So you create a branding around it, you rally a community around it, and you get that place notified. And I would say that you would find that very, very fulfilling, because in my life, like Vidya was talking about that app which we created, the Dhara app, I found that work very fulfilling, because I got to, what we did has had an impact on every village of Rajasthan. There are 50,000 villages in Rajasthan, and we got the land records of all the 50,000 villages cleaned up. For that, all, the notorious Patwaris, whom people say that they don't do anything without taking money, they cleaned up those land records for free for the entire population of Rajasthan. So I did that experiment on a large scale. I mean, this was after having been in the IAS for 14 years. Before that, also, I did similar experiments at a much smaller scale, where we involved a set of people and we did some things which worked, which changed things for all time to come. So what brings about fulfillment is when other people's lives get fulfilled, when they get something that they want. and you become an instrument in making that happen, then it's a very fulfilling experience. So I would say that if young people want to bring about that societal change, you should work with a community and really get to know them. Go live. I'm sure, wildlife research gives you ample opportunity to go live with the community and interact with them. And so once you have a model which works, then you will need some administrative and legal support to get some legal protection around it, because there could be other forces. Tomorrow you found this beautiful place where a particular community is conserving this, but then in the local hill tomorrow a mine is discovered and the miner doesn't care. He wants to get rich in 6 months time, so he's going to get a mining lease and come and dig the whole place up. So you need some legal protection for that area to be able to protect it from those interests. So the community reserve notification, for that you will need consensus with the local DFO and the local collector of that area. And if you go and meet them and present your idea, I'm sure they would be open to it. It depends on how you approach and what kind of relationship you build with those people.
So you're saying that change is possible only through through other actors who have the power to change the system, and therefore then us building our relationships with them beforehand is very important, right?
Yes, see, only those things will work which are a win-win-win solution. If there is anybody who does not benefit from the solution that you propose, that person will become your enemy. He will oppose it. Then you are in a endless struggle. See, essentially we are all animals. We are all trying to survive here. So the miner is also trying to survive. He thinks his survival is earning 20 crore rupees in 6 months. That's his survival. The farmer there, his survival is he wants to make sure that his 10 cattle, give him milk and he's able to make ghee and sell. The farmer there, somebody else wants to do something. So for everybody, it's a question of survival. And when it's a game of survival, then people can fight. You see in the forest, right? For the tiger to survive, he has to kill the deer and eat it. So, but human beings have the possibility of going beyond survival. So where you create a situation where everybody feels that what you're going to do is going to benefit them. So if you are able, so people often ask, this is one of the cliched things which they teach us in the academy, IAS academy, that try to create win-win-win situations. But I have found that that's the only thing which has worked in my career. Whenever I'm able to create a win-win-win situation, change happens, and change stays even after I have left the place, because people found that whatever I did is useful for them. So when you say you want to build a relationship, see, the DFO of that area, his career is dependent on what happens in that area. So if he is able to create a community reserve with your help, for him, it's a feather in his cap. So if he sees that by creating this community reserve, my career progresses, he'll be very happy. If the collector of that area also sees that, I did something beyond the routine, I left, a footprint on the sands of time, as, another cliched phrase, by helping this researcher create a community reserve, he'll help you. If the MLA of that area also sees that creating this community reserve will boost some economic activity in the area, he will also help you. Once these three people are aligned, the MLA of that area, the collector, and the DFO, then any conservation project will take off. The MLA will go and pitch it to the minister and to the chief minister and get their approval. If an MLA is behind it and the collector is behind it and the DFO is behind it, there's a 90% chance that you will succeed.
So that's kind of like a lesson to people working in our field as well, because we rarely engage with other stakeholders. Like when we start working, it's our research, and then we publish scientific papers, although everybody really wants to pretty much contribute to society as well. So yeah, I definitely it is something that we all need to learn and understand how to better engage and get all these people on our side. So lastly, I would like you to talk a little bit. The Kaveri calling work, Rally for Rivers and all has had some negative press, and even I didn't understand it much, because what we see as plantation is essentially, planting semi-arid landscapes and changing one natural ecosystem into something that will not sustain the nature over there anymore. So can you just tell us a little bit about this work that you're doing now?
Yes, so for last 1.5 years, I am on deputation with Isha Outreach, which is a public charitable trust, which has been doing various agroecological initiatives for the last 15-20 years. We started off with something called Project Green Hands in Tamil Nadu about 15 years ago, where I would have to bring in Sadhguru here, because he is the person who is the founder of this whole initiative. And he did a meditative process about 15-20 years ago for the people at that time, where he made them experience that the trees are part of you. Like he says that trees are one part of your lungs, which is just hanging outside, right? Without the trees, you will not have the air that you breathe. So he made people experience that. Then a whole bunch of people got inspired by that, and they said, okay, we are going to plant trees. So he gave them a target of planting 11 crore trees in Tamil Nadu in a period of 7 years. And they said 11 crore trees, it's just impossible. So then a whole lot of people, they went around and they tried various ways of doing it. They worked with the schools of Tamil Nadu. They did what is called a green school movement, where they would give seeds to children. They would nurture a seedling, and then they go plant it and they take care of it. Then they also worked on trying to plant community land. Then they started working with farmers. And eventually, when they started working with farmers, they realized that this is the way forward. That today in India, 80% or plus land is with the farmers. And more than 80% of fresh water in India is today used in agriculture. So actually, ecologically speaking, agriculture is a bigger, kind of habitat land use change. It's the biggest land use change which has happened since hunter-gatherer times. Even today, despite all the pollution and industrial stuff, but sheerly in terms of volume, it is agriculture which has made the most significant impact on biodiversity and on water. So when they started working with the farmers, they realized that the farmers have a very bad deal in India. And in India, you will be surprised to know that India is the largest, is the only large nation where 50% of people do farming. In China, the number is 6%. In most US and Europe, the number is between 1 and 2% of the population. But in India, 50% of the people do agriculture. And traditionally in India, farmers used to grow trees on their land. But during the British rule, there was a huge railway network expansion which happened. And you know that initially all the railway sleepers were made of very good quality hardwood. So they came up with the Indian Forest Act in 1927, where in the definition, they defined timber as forest produce, irrespective of where the timber came from. And they empowered the forest department to regulate the transit of timber. So it created a situation where if I have a teak tree or a rosewood tree standing on my land, I can cut it, but I can't transport it. So I can cut it and use it, but I cannot transport it without forest department's permission. And to get that transit permit, it's known as TP in local lingo. It takes anywhere from 3 months to 2 years, depending on how much running around you do and how many people you bribe or you whatever influence you use, whatever it takes. So it involves the forest department as well as the revenue department. Both departments are involved in giving you the TP. So we studied this process and we realized that the revenue department, the only thing they're doing is they come to your land and they look at it and tell, okay, these 3 trees are standing in Amrish's land. So that is the certificate which they give. So that means the tree is your tree. Then you cut the tree and the forest department will come, they will measure all the tree and calculate the timber in it. And then they give you a transit permit, which is valid for a very short duration, because the forest department is scared that you will take this TP and you will cut 5 times the amount of timber in natural forest and you will sell it as yours. So because of that, I mean, that is today's reality that I'm talking about. So that is why it has become such a restrictive process. So over a period of time, the farmers just gave up growing timber on their land because it's just not worth it. Tomorrow, if you put such restrictions on growing rice and wheat, they will stop growing rice and wheat. So the government of India has recognized this in their National Agroforestry Policy of 2014. And in fact, they've been asking state governments to come up with exempted species from this transit regime. And most states have come up with notifications, but they have notified those species which nobody wants to grow. Because, because that does not endanger the natural forest. So this is the reality today, because of which farmers are not growing trees on their land. So in the last 15 years, we have identified a set of about between 10 to 15 species, which the farmers find economically remunerative and they are native to that area. We don't promote any exotic, only species which grow in that land and which fetch them good return and ecologically are beneficial. So a few key species that we promote are teak, sandalwood, rosewood, mahogany, bamboo, and something called Milia dubia, and jamun, jackfruit, and a few more species, and something called white teak, shivne, and honne. There are a few more species like that which we promote. Plus, this is the broad species list which we are promoting across Karnataka, I mean, the 9 Kaveri districts of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. And of course, I mean, these species are depending on the rainfall of that pattern of that area. Some species are preferred in those areas and some species are not preferred. So also we tell the farmer not to do monoculture. We have a certain combinations of species which where the trees grow well together, and those species is what we ask the farmer to grow. And also we promote black pepper cultivation on timber trees, so that once black pepper takes root, farmer gets a regular income from this black pepper, so he will not cut the trees. Timber will become secondary in his calculation. So that is another thing we promote. Plus, we also ask him to grow certain shade-loving crops. He can do intercropping with the trees. So like that, there are various models. So farmer can only do plantation along the bunds of his land. Single layer boundary plantation is what we call that. Or he can do a double layer boundary, or he can do a block plantation. And we have calculated for every species what kind of spacing is there. I mean, from our own experience and also picking up from forest department's experience, we have created brochures for farmers, we have created videos for farmers, and we circulated it to them. And in Tamil Nadu, we have about 32 nurseries which we have set up, where these seedlings, I would call, are grown. And we grow them without using any chemicals. So they are grown purely through natural methods, no pesticide, no fertilizer, no chemical fertilizer. And it takes us longer to grow them. Wherever the commercial nurseries will grow these in 3 to 4 months, and whereas it takes us from 7 to 9 months. But we find that these seedlings are hardier and the survival rates are better. So I think last year in Tamil Nadu, we grew about 80 lakhs such seedlings in these 32 nurseries, where farmers come and take these seedlings. And initially, we had pegged the price of seedling to the price of a cup of tea in Tamil Nadu. So initially, one seedling you could buy for 5 rupees. Then the cup of tea became 7 rupees. So we made it 7 rupees. But now recently we have brought down that price to 3 rupees, because in Karnataka, the government gives it out for 3 rupees. So for uniformity, we have brought it to 3 rupees. So we don't give free seedlings, because we realize that anything given free doesn't work. So we raise funds. Of course, our cost of production is higher than what we are charging to the farmer, but we give it to them for this price. And we have a lot of volunteers and staff who go and motivate farmers, who visit their farms. In fact, we have a person who used to run a chemist shop before he got really into tree plantation. He left his chemist shop. Now he's a full-time volunteer, and he's like a real expert on agroforestry, because he has visited so many farmers, so many farms. And there are, I have personally gone and seen land which was degraded land, where there is saline water. So it's very difficult for trees to take root in that kind of saline water. You know that along coastal Tamil Nadu, there is a lot of saline ingress into land because of groundwater table going down. So saline water has come in. So in that area, so they found a solution where they made bunds, raised bunds, and so between the bunds there is like a 3-foot trench. So when rain falls, there is fresh water available for the trees, and the trees are grown on bunds, and the trees are really doing very well there. So essentially, our effort is that we want to achieve India's national aspiration of having 33% of land under tree cover. And for that, we are working with the farmers, and we are asking them to convert between 10 to 30% of their land into tree-based agriculture. What we are calling it as tree-based agriculture. So what we realize is that if you want to do something on a large enough scale, you've got to plug into the economic aspiration of the person. There is no other way to achieve scale in today's world except to plug into the economic aspiration of that person. And trees act as a fixed deposit and an insurance policy for the farmer. So if I have, let's say, 1,000 trees on my land, and 20 years later, let's say each tree will sell for 1 lakh. So that means 10 crores of rupees I will have after 20 years. It's not for any of us, it's a huge amount of money. I mean, I just think about it now, that when I was a great activist and conservationist in IIT days, if I had gone and planted 1,000 trees on my father's land, today I would not have to think about, I wouldn't have to think about money. I would have crores of rupees sitting in those trees. And out of that, I can just sell a few trees out of 1,000 trees. If I sell, let's say 20 trees, 30 trees in a year, I mean, my job's done. I have enough money to have a reasonable middle class lifestyle. I don't need to do anything else, and I can replant those 20, 30 trees, and the cycle continues. And so this is the kind of thing that we are promoting with the farmers. So it is an insurance policy, because let's say tomorrow there is a disease in farmer's family and he needs a lot of money for medical care. He can just cut 5 trees. He doesn't have to go and take money from the money lender. And it is a fixed deposit. Let's say a lot of people are growing Millia dubia. So the price of Millia dubia in the market has come down. You don't have to cut it. You don't have to sell it. Just let it grow. In a few years, it will be even more valuable. The wood will only increase with time. The quality will only improve with time. So this is basically the model that we have in Kaveri Calling, and we are working with the state governments. So there are existing government schemes which incentivize the farmer to grow trees on his land. There is something called Submission on Agroforestry by Ministry of Agriculture. Then Karnataka government has something called Krishi Aranya Protsaha Yojane, where they give about 125 rupees per surviving tree to a farmer over a period of 3 years. And plus they give subsidized seedlings at 1 rupee or 3 rupee per seedling. And like that, there are, also, and there is a scheme called NREGS, which you all must be aware of, National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So small and marginal farmers and scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, women-headed households, and physically handicapped-headed households and BPL families. So all the poorer sections of the society who have small land holdings, they can grow trees on their land, and they can be paid wage labor by the government. So under that, every family can get 100 days of wage labor in a year, which amounts to about 30,000 rupees in most states. So they can get paid 30,000 rupees, and in 30,000 rupees, they can plant trees on their land. So we are also promoting that in Karnataka amongst poorer farmers. And so there are multiple benefits of, so I see Kaveri calling as a win-win-win solution. So who is it win-win-win for? Let's enumerate it. We have seen how it is a win-win-win for the farmer. It's also win-win for the farmer in other ways. So leaf litter, which falls from the trees, it enhances the organic content of the soil. So if you look at soil scientifically, for something to be called as soil, it needs to have between 3 to 6% of organic content. And today in India, more than 50% of the soil has less than 0.5% organic content left. Because traditionally, there are only two sources of organic content. One is leaf litter. We already discussed how farmers have stopped growing trees. And second is the animal dung. So, today, I mean, all that romantic image of a farmer going behind two bullocks, now how rare that is to find. So most farmers have switched to tractors, so no more animal dung. So how else do you get organic content in the soil? And government has been promoting chemical agriculture since the Green Revolution since the 1960s, and now slowly they are shifting to, they gave Padma Shri to this man who's promoting zero budget natural farming, Subhash Palekar. So there is a slow shift. I was Commissioner Agriculture in Rajasthan. I would just share this anecdote with you. It was one of the most painful postings I've had in my experience. So this land records posting which I did, that is known as a punishment posting, because they were not happy with me in agriculture department, so they gave me land records. So that's how I went there. And before that, I was also in a punishment posting called social welfare, where we did fantastic work with hostels for children. But so when they were happy with my work in social welfare, they gave me agriculture. It is considered as a prized posting. But when I went there, I realized that all I was doing was spending 2,500 crores rupees a year, which benefits between 1 to 2% of Rajasthan's farmers. And all I'm doing is promoting chemical agriculture. That's all I'm doing. All my schemes essentially promote chemical agriculture. So I called a meeting of all the senior officers and I asked them, I said, maybe I'm mistaken. You guys are the ones who have a PhD in agriculture, who have a master's degree in agriculture. Please tell me, are pesticides good for human health or are they bad for human health? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I read all this activist literature which says they're bad. Maybe it's actually good. So they said, no, sir, we agree with you that pesticides are not good for human health. I said, if you all agree to this, and then they also said, sir, we actually don't eat this pesticide food. My brother is there in the village. In 1 acre of land, he grows food without any chemicals, and he sends me that, and that's what I eat. I said, okay, that's very interesting to hear that you don't personally eat chemical food. Then who are you growing this chemical food for? They said, sir, how will we feed the population of our country if we don't use chemicals? So I found that very interesting. I said, really? Then I went to statistics of food production in India. Per capita food production in India in 1947 was 450 grams per person per day. Today also it's 450 grams per person per day. So, but interestingly, in 1947, an average Indian had 3 times the amount of pulses to eat than he has today. So the protein intake has become 1/3 because of Green Revolution. And the oil intake has gone up by 3 times and sugar intake has gone up by 3 times. So now you know why India is the diabetes capital of the world, right? You have switched from eating protein to sugar and oil. So this is what we have done with the farming community. And today, when we looked at, when I went and met the farmers and I talked to them, they said, sir, actually your department is useless. We don't want your advanced seeds. We don't want all the pesticides and fertilizers you give us. We know how to grow food. We've been growing it for thousands of years. But can you get me proper return for what I'm growing? Can you, today I'm growing tomato. This year it's selling at 20 rupees. By the time my crop comes, the price falls to 1 rupee. And I don't get, even if I were to work as a laborer in somebody's field, I will earn more money than to grow these tomatoes. And it keeps happening to tomatoes, it happens to pulses, it happens to ginger, it happens to, all the so-called cash crops. So there is no way that you are able to assure me of a certain income. So when I saw all this in agriculture department, so at that time I realized that agroforestry is a way out for farmers. It's a solution which can happen. But then growing trees in the government sphere, it is no man's land, because agriculture department doesn't know anything about timber trees, right? They only know about, at most, the horticulture, which is sister department, knows about fruit trees. But agriculture department only knows about field crops. They have no experts on timber trees. The only experts which exist on timber trees are in forest department. And you know the reputation of the forest department. They are known as a regulatory department, policing department. They can't work with the farmers. I mean, they have done many things like joint forest management and stuff, but there nothing is on any significant scale. I mean, there would be just a few pilot projects here and there. So if you want to work with 50% of Rajasthan's population, 3.5 crore, actually 65%, 4.5 crore people who do agriculture in Rajasthan, then forest department doesn't have a solution, even though they have nurseries. So that is something which we have solved in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. So here in Karnataka, the forest department is a little more enlightened. This scheme, Krishi Aranya Protsaha Yojana, was started in the year 2011. Before Kaveri calling came around, they had realized that if they want to increase the green cover, they need to work with the farmers. But so what we are doing is we are helping them catalyze the scheme and scale it up. So even though they have been giving plants to people, but if you ask them for statistical data on how many plants actually got planted, how many of them survived, what is the economic benefit that the farmer derived, those are questions they all want to have answers to, but they don't have those answers. They all want those answers. So in the last 2 years, we learned that this is an issue. So we told them, okay, we have a target of planting 2.42 billion trees in the next decade. So that means 20 crore trees per year, if you do simple math on a linear scale. So 20 crore trees in the 28 districts of Kaveri Basin. So now if you ask me where that number has come from, it's come from a very simple calculation of 300 trees per acre spread over about 20 to about 30% of 100,000 square kilometers. Okay, that's where the number has come from, right? It's the entire Kaveri Basin area is about 100,000 square kilometers. You do take 80% of which is agricultural land, you do 30% of that, and you do 300 trees per acre, you will come to 242 crores, somewhere in that range. Okay, so people will say, why do you want to plant such a large number? You will destroy the ecosystems which exist there. So I want to say that we are only working with the farmer's ecosystem. We are not doing any plantation on forest land or government land or community land. So in my understanding, for largely, we will be helping enhance the biodiversity on farmers' land. We will be helping enhance the organic content of the soil. Plus, if the trees come on farmers' land, when the rain falls, it will prevent soil erosion and it will hold the moisture for longer with the root system of the trees. So eventually, the streams which flow for short duration in a year, they will flow for longer, and we will have more flow in the river Kaveri, hopefully after a decade or so, by the time we manage to do this whole thing. Plus, we are creating a huge carbon sink, right? We are trying to fulfill India's agenda in the Paris Accord of doing carbon sequestration. Plus, when all this happens, when the organic content gets enhanced in the soil microbiology, microbiology is not the right word, soil biology changes. All the microorganisms in the soil, they have now something to live on. So that is essentially what contributes to the fertility of the soil. So this is something very interesting, which I learned from this man who promotes zero budget natural farming. I once attended his talk for about 3 hours. And I found that he has a very scientific approach to agriculture. He's saying that it is not that the nutrients don't exist in the soil. They exist. But those nutrients have to be available to the plants. For them to be available, you need bacteria in the soil, which will break down these nutrients and make them into a way the plants can absorb. So when we use the word organic agriculture, what we mean is organism-based agriculture rather than chemical-based agriculture. So when you say organisms, it's largely microorganisms in the soil. So these microorganisms, for them to live, you need organic content in the soil. So all this is another outcome of what we are doing. Plus, we are also promoting fruit cultivation. So if, I mean, again, I will quote Sadhguru here. Sadhguru says that if people convert 30% of their diet to fruit, 80% of chronic diseases will come down. You know, if fruit consumption goes up in a significant way in India, a lot of disease will come down. I can say that in my own case, as my personal experience, for the last 20 years, I've been doing the yoga, which I learned from Sadhguru, and I also made these changes in my diet. So every day I eat about 30% raw food in my diet, either fresh fruit or salads. And touch wood, I have not used any of my medical, I have not yet submitted a medical bill to the government. So, and I don't visit the doctors. So before I did all this, I used to have a cold and cough and throat infections every 3 to 6 months, and fever every few months, and so many of those things which are now become passing visitors. I get them about once in 2 years instead of once in 3 months. So we are promoting fruit cultivation. That's another aspect. Plus, so these are the various benefits which are there for the farmer. And as the trees return to the land, so do other forms of life like birds and animals. They also return along, because once their habitat is restored, even though partially, of course, we can't say that the farms will become like forests. They don't. I mean, actually, under the trees, the feel is much more forest-like than farm-like. I mean, I have visited a lot of farmers who planted trees 10 years ago, and when I go to their farm, I feel like, wow, it has a very different feel compared to just a open field where they're growing ragi or they're growing rice. So it is a win-win for farmer, for ecology, and for the government also. So today, about 70% of timber which is used is imported. I was surprised to find out that Australia is a big exporter of sandalwood to India. So they realized this whole thing about 50 years ago. They have huge Indian sandalwood plantations in Australia, and they harvest them and they sell them to India. So in India, because of whatever policies, the sandalwood was declared as a state tree. Nobody was allowed to grow it. Nobody was allowed to cut it. I think in year 2001 or 3, they changed it. Now in Karnataka, anybody can grow sandalwood, but they have to sell it only to a few select government agencies. So sandalwood has become a rare commodity with huge sandalwood smuggling gangs. Once they cut a tree in my house in Rajasthan, I only realized that I had a sandalwood tree after it got stolen. So and today there are many African countries which grow Indian teak and they export it to India. So like that, there are, tomorrow if you want to build a house, go and find out 70% of timber available in any sawmill today is imported timber. So when farmers grow this whole thing, which whatever is getting imported, we will have our own timber to replace that within India. So these are all, and if large segments of population are happy and economically well off, politicians are happy, right? So they are also a significant stakeholder. If politicians are happy, the bureaucrats who work under them are very happy.
Yeah, thanks, Ambrish, for that. Shall I open it up to questions? Can you all please type in the chat box? And if anybody has a question, you all can even just raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask as well. Yeah, Imran, unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Amriji, for such a wonderful talk. You are very candid and very open, and you're giving ideas which looks very simple in implementation. And I am sure we'll take a leap from this. Generally, we have um, this fear or phobia, if you approach IAS officer, how do you behave with them? How do you go and talk to them? Because what happens is we generally work with forest department, and forest department at times is at loggerheads with IAS officers because they come in conflict due to the development projects with forest departments are kind of having a different mandate. So how do you see this? How do we, first of all, how do you see this? You must have had this experience of some friction between forest department of the area and IAS officer trying to do some development or community work, and forest department is saying that you can't do. And secondly, how do you think that we as NGOs should approach a IAS officer? What do you see as do you see as part of forest department, or especially the wildlife NGOs I'm talking about?
Okay, so two parts of the question about conflict with the forest department. Yes, it is definitely, forest department is definitely perceived that way. And I would say it is the design of the forest department. It's not the individual forest officer. That's how the Indian Forest Service and the forest department was restructured by Indira Gandhi, I would say. Right? Before that, forest department used to be a commercial department whose job was to exploit the forest and make money for the government. But during Indira Gandhi's regime, when all Wildlife Conservation Act came around, the Environment Protection Act came, and Environment Protection Act came after she died, but the Forest Conservation Act came. So all these acts came during her time. So it was kind of conservation from the top. And forest department's culture developed around, okay, our job is to protect the forest against all kinds of people coming in. So protecting the forest has always been in their DNA. I mean, that's how they were created, to stop all the local people from accessing the forest and conserving it for the British Empire. That's how they were created. So it's slowly now it has gotten shifted to, okay, so actually they are just doing their job. Let me just say it this way. So Forest Conservation Act says that you cannot divert any forest land without the permission of the central government. So now, if you want to take permission of the central government, DFO has to give his view, then his boss has to give his view, then his boss has to give his view, then it has to go to central government and they have to take a view on that. So looking at it from two perspectives. One thing is forest department is the owner of forest land, right? So they are the landlords. Why would anybody want to give their piece of land to anybody? So coming from a basic animal instinct, nobody will want to say yes. So why will forest department say yes, please take my land? They will not want to say yes. So it's natural that they're seen as anti-development because, whatever we define as development today, so-called development, a lot of it involves wherever large projects are there, forest land naturally comes into the picture. So how do you handle it's the design of the system. So I don't hold it against the forest officers. Personally, I don't hold it against them. It's their job. They're just doing their job. So second part of the question is, how do you approach IAS officers? I think you can just go meet them. See, any of the young researchers here, they could write the civil services exam and tomorrow and become an IAS officer or an IFS officer. It's very much a choice. I think many of the researchers have also taken that choice in the past and they continue to do so. They're just like, you and me. You can go and meet them and you can share whatever you want to share about what you're doing in their area. They'll be happy to hear it. But see, one thing is that person, he is in a position of a very large responsibility, right? So if you are running any large organization, right? If tomorrow one of the researchers comes to Vidya and puts in a request for something, so Vidya has to see, okay, if I say yes to this, how will everybody else perceive it? Is it as per the rules of my organization? If I'm doing something new, how will it be perceived by my bosses? All this she has to factor in before she gives a response. So if she has to do this in WCS, imagine an IAS officer's life. He has to look at so many different stakeholders before he gives you a response to whatever you ask him for, right? Especially when it comes to something to do with the public. If you're just asking for something personal, oh, I am come to do research, can you ask somebody there to provide me a place to live? I think he'll be very happy to help you with those small things. So, but if you are talking about, can you create a community reserve? Can you create a conservation reserve? Then you have to come fully prepared, because at most he can help you by saying, okay, these are the 15 questions that need to be answered if this community reserve has to be created. You go take these 15 questions and come prepared with the answers to all these 15 questions. Then we'll look at your proposal. And by all means, you should go and meet them. Definitely, you should go and meet them, right? Each person, they will have their own personality. And one more thing you should do is, you should invite them to come and see your work. If you really want them to appreciate what you are doing, you should invite them, host them someplace in the forest where you are staying, show them around, show them some animals, show them some birds, and feed them some good forest food. They will be your friends after that.
Yeah, thanks, Amrish sir. And Dev Charan has a question which he has typed in the chat box. So I wish he had asked it himself. He says, I hope this question is not irrelevant. May I ask you how long you have been in Karnataka? I ask because your pronunciation of Kannada words, tree names is perfect. Also, how important is mastering the local language to be able to engage with the local communities?
Very relevant question. I've been struggling with Kannada. I've been wanting to learn. I have 5 books which I have bought. I enrolled for an online course to learn Kannada. But still, I can't speak Kannada. I can understand a bit of it. So yes, I've been in Karnataka for last 2 years. But still, I'm yet to understand and speak Kannada. In fact, I want to read all the government orders which I get, which are written in Kannada. So all that, it's on my agenda. One of these days, I will shut down my phone and just read Kannada for 10-15 days. After that, I'll get started. So, and how important it is to know the local language, I think it's absolutely essential. If you really want to, without language, to build a rapport with people is like, trying to climb a mountain without legs. Maybe if you are really super, you can do it with your feet, with your hands, and you can go up without the legs. But most people would need legs to climb the mountain. So I think it is spend that effort to learn the language. It will be your whole experience will be much, much richer.
Yeah, thank you so much. Saloni just has a comment. She says, fabulous talk, sir. Thank you for taking your time to share your experiences. If there's no other question, then I am just going to, no other question?
Hi, Vidya. I have one question.
Yeah, please, Vinayaka. Ask.
Hello, sir. I'm Vinayaka. I'm a conservationist based in Central Western Ghats in Karnataka. I have one specific question. Javai is a very peculiar example. What we have learned through our experience over the last 10 years and also through many of the research papers available, that humans and wildlife, especially large mammals, they cannot exist together, or there will be conflict. So having said that, you might have also dealt with this projects. What is your view on voluntary relocation of families from protected areas?
Okay. So, the question has many aspects to it. See, one thing you are saying is Javai is an exception. I will say every place is an exception, right? See, when you make a law, you cannot make a law for every area. So you make a general law. But how you implement the law will depend on the culture of that area and the kind of history which has existed in that area. So, I think there is an example of eagle's nest in Arunachal Pradesh, where Ramana has worked with the local community to create a conservation project where people earn money from bird tours. And I'm sure there are many other examples in India, which I'm not aware of, where people have done it in different ways. So when you say relocation of villages from forest areas, I would say it's a case-to-case basis. I mean, you can relocate them if you want. I mean, that's what the Wildlife Act says, and a whole lot of them have been relocated. But see, the way I would look at it is, what is my vision for this protected area going forward? That's how I would look at it, right? So me as an officer, I would have a tenure of maybe 2 or 3 years in that area. After that, I would have probably nothing to do with that area. That is how all the decision makers would think, whether they are in the IFS or IAS, because none of them would have a tenure beyond 3 years in an area. As a researcher also, there would be very few researchers who will spend their entire life in a particular area. You will do a research project for 2-3 years, then you will go do your PhD in US, then you will go do something else somewhere else. You will want to do something else. So who is going to live there? It is those people who are going to live there forever. Now, if their well-being and the well-being of the protected area, both of those things you have to think together. If the well-being can happen by them living in the forest, let them live in the forest. If the well-being will happen through relocation, relocate them, help them relocate. So question is of creating that situation where they don't see you as an outsider, where they see you as a person who is standing for their well-being. So the forest's well-being is essential for their well-being. This is how I would look at it. See, if somebody has lived in the forest, if the forest itself goes, then they are no longer a forest community. I mean, they are just like any other impoverished village anywhere else. Because without the land being rich, there is no such thing as a rich village. Village is all about the land being rich. And so how do you create it? I would say it is case-to-case basis. You have to spend the time, win their trust, understand their life, and look forward with a vision of, okay, in the next 50 years, next 100 years, what kind of life should these people have, where the forest also stays, right? Create a win-win situation. So based on that, you have to take a call how you want to handle it.
Thanks, sir. Last question I'll ask Vanishri to ask.
Hi Vidya, this is Vani and me, Nikhil from Mumbai Leopard.
Hello.
So thanks a lot. It was really amazing to hear from you and some of the ideas, and as someone mentioned earlier, some simplistic ideas, and also the fact that you work with people so much. So I just have one request: if you could share one positive and one negative interaction or association you had while trying out these ideas.
One positive and one negative. Okay, I would see, when it comes to, let me say, challenging thing, right, rather than negative. So,
okay, sir.
So I had a situation where I'll give you an example of my office. So in the social welfare department, my department was notorious for people not coming on time and not being present in office. So we implemented a simple technological solution, fingerprint-based attendance, right? So we said, twice a day you have to do attendance. Once when you come in the morning, once when you leave in the evening. So we got the machines put up in the office, and we issued an order. Everybody has to do attendance twice a day. So one day I was sitting in my office and I hear people shouting slogans. So I asked the other officer sitting, who is this guy shouting slogans? They said, they're our staff only. I said, why are they shouting slogans? Sir, they are unhappy with this fingerprint attendance thing. I said, really? Okay. So I got out of my office. I came outside the office in the courtyard. They were standing in. So when I came there, they became quiet. I said, I heard that you're unhappy about fingerprint attendance. They said, yes, sir, this is too harsh on us. And, sometimes women have to go back early. It gets dark in the winters. We have to go home, cook and feed our children. I said, okay, all that is fine. But why are you shouting slogans? Why don't you just talk to me? Then they said, Acha. I said, okay, why come to the meeting hall? Let's have a conversation. Why do you want to have it on the street standing like this? Let's go inside. So everybody came inside. So we sat in the meeting hall. Whoever could sit, they stood. Whoever could stand, they stood around. Then I said, okay, tell me now, what's your issue? They said, sir, even Secretariat doesn't have it. Why do you want to have this fingerprint attendance? I said, see, in every organization, there are people who work very hard and there are people who loaf around. Okay. I don't have a problem with it, but you guys have a problem with it, that I know. Because you know that your neighbor gets the same salary as you and he doesn't do any work and you are in office for 12 hours a day. So all I'm trying to do is this attendance will bring that out. Whatever is the result of the attendance, we'll post it on the notice board every week. So you can see who is spending how much time in office. Right? I said, I promise you, I will not cut anybody's salary based on this attendance. Okay. I will not take disciplinary action also against you. So all I'm trying to do is bring it out into the open. That's all I'm trying to do. So then they were satisfied. Then the women said, no, sir, but we have to go early. I said, there are 200 people in this office who work. I don't even know most of you. I hardly interact with each one of you personally. If your boss allows you to go early, just go early. What's my problem? Your job is to make sure your boss is fine with your work. That's all. Whoever your boss is, if he allows you to go at 3 o'clock, you go at 3 o'clock. Whatever time he allows, you just go. I don't have a problem. All I'm saying is mark your attendance and go so that we know when you come in and when you go out. So they were satisfied. So, simple thing, just by having a conversation, it got resolved. And about positive things, I would say in that social welfare department, so we did something very simple. When I joined that department, it's again one of the punishment postings. So I went and met the Secretary to Chief Minister. I was very crestfallen when they had transferred me. My previous posting was only for 6 months. He says, Ambrish, I know what you are thinking about this posting, but there are these hostels for children in your department which are in very bad shape. And there is nothing that can be done about them. The only thing which can be done is you find some corporates and you take them to unko bolo ki isko god le lein. They should adopt these hostels and look after them. I said, okay, sir, let me see what I can do about the hostels. So after a couple of months of joining, when I settled down, I started visiting these hostels. And I realized that the basic issue in hostels was that there was no maintenance. So I asked them, okay, boss, this tube light is not working. I asked the warden, why don't you replace it? This fan is not working. Why don't you get it fixed? He says, sir, I don't have any budget. I said, really? Okay. But I give you 2,000 rupees per child per month to look after these children. Why don't you have budget? So he went inside. He brought the order of 2,000 rupees. He showed me, sir, in this, there is head of milk. There is head of vegetables. There is head of washing soap. Where is the head of maintenance? I said, yeah, sahi bol raha hai. There is no maintenance head. So I went back to my office. I changed the order and I put 50 rupees for maintenance and I reduced 5 rupees from other heads. And I said, now you have 50 rupees per child per month to maintain the hostel. So please maintain it. It should at least look like the way your home looks. At least that much you do, right? So after a month, the feedback came, sir, all that money is exhausted. We have done some improvement, but we need more money. So I called my accounts officer. I asked him, do we have any maintenance budget? He says, yes, sir, we have 7 crore rupees for maintenance of hostels. I said, okay, so what are you doing with 7 crore rupees? Sir, we have given it to PWD for maintaining 25 hostels. I said, but we have 700 hostels. If you give all 7 crores to 25, what will the remaining 675 do? He didn't have an answer to that. I said, okay, you cancel this money to PWD. We will give it to the hostel wardens. So we came up with a formula, 1,000 rupees per child. So some hostels are 25 children hostels, some are 50 children, some are 100 children. So 1,000 rupees per child we gave as maintenance budget to all the hostels. And we gave them a simple list. Okay, call the local electrician, call the local plumber, call the carpenter, call the person who does paint job. Your hostel must look like at least your home. Okay, just do it. And I sent all the people from headquarters to the districts. We made 11 teams of 3 people each, gave them each an Innova car and said, you must visit 3 districts, go to hostel, talk to these guys and get this done. In next 6 months, 80% of our hostels became like model hostels. The minister had told me, Ambrish ji, can we make at least one model hostel? Hostels are bringing us very bad name. I said, sir, why one? Why don't we do all of them? So 80% of the hostels got fixed. Does that mean there was no corruption? I'm sure there was some corruption. Some of those guys would have eaten some part of that money. I'm sure, like that, some things would have happened. But 80% of the hostels, which, in living memory, nobody saw them as proper places to live, they became proper places to live. So, it was very fulfilling for me that, what people thought cannot be done, we did it without going to anybody for any extra budget, within our resources, using the people in our department, in a department which was notorious for not doing anything. So I think all it takes is willingness to include them as part of your life, not to look down upon them, not to see them as corrupt people, not to see them as useless people. See, that's the image which has gotten created of all government employees. They are just our relatives only, no? Some uncle, aunt, or cousin is in the government service. That's all they are. So they are just the same as you. They are working in a situation which has a certain system. And if you have the eyes to see what you want, then that will happen in the world. What you want must be clear to you. Most people know what they don't want. They don't know what is needed. They know I don't want this, but what is needed, that I don't know. All right.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ambrish ji, for this last. It was quite inspiring to hear that. And just another question: are those hostels still in the same? Is the process still on even now?
Yes. So one of my batchmates is the secretary of the department, and he keeps telling me that he's continuing the work, and we called it as a Bhavan Sudharo Abhiyan. So they say that every year they carry out that Bhavan Sudharo Abhiyan, where they keep fixing those things.
Nice. Yeah. I would really like to thank you for taking a lot of your time today. And again, all of us are very grateful that you could join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vidya. I would just close by giving a small association or fleeting association that I had with WCS. When I was working in the US, I saw on one of the natural history lists, I saw a mail by a person called William Robichaud, who was doing some wildlife project in Southeast Asia and who was inviting applications. So I applied for it. I was not happy with my IT job. I thought, let me go to the forest and do a job there. But I never got that job. So here I am.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that name is familiar to me. I just wrote it down because I think I forgot that name too. Yeah. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Vidya. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, no, thank you again. Thanks all for attending.